Welcome to the program. Roy Hange joins me. He teaches at the Summer Peacebuilding Institute at Eastern Mennonite University and also teaches peacebuilding at the University of Virginia. He has worked on peace issues with NGOs in the Middle East for many decades. Roy, thank you for being here.
It's good to be here.
I want to talk about the Middle East. I want to talk about issues that show up in our headlines in America and sort of help us unpack that and understand what we should understand, what we should know about what's really happening in the Middle East. And I want to start with a place that you know very well, Syria. Mm-hmm. The U.S. and Russia continue to fight something of a proxy war in Syria, as we have done around the globe for decades. Help us understand Syria. Help us understand Bashar Assad, the president of Syria, with whom you know, you have been in the room with him on more than one occasion. What do we need to know about Syria, Roy?
I lived in Syria between 1991 and 1997, and that was a time when peace was very close. President Clinton visited, and a little before that, I was in touch with folks who were close to the peace process, and even Israeli tour guides were sending agents into Syria to work at package tours. I was on the Hill in Congressman Hamilton's office and was shown about a 15-foot map and shown the place where about 10 acres of land were the difference between peace or not in the agreement. That was very close. Syria was at the point of coming to terms with connecting with Israel on a peace term, similar to the way Egypt had under Carter in the Camp David peace accords. That fell apart for various reasons. Syria was set up by the French colonial powers when, in the 1920s, the British and French divided up the Middle East into various colonial statelets after the Ottoman Empire fell.
The Sykes-Picot Agreement.
The Sykes-Picot Agreement led to that dismantling of the Ottoman Empire after World War I. So, in relation to the vision of the Islamic State right now, they broke down one of the borders between Syria and Iraq as one of the first symbolic acts of dismantling the Sykes-Picot boundaries and creating a new Islamic State in the region. That's their vision to reverse what happened under the colonial divisions that the French and the British worked out.
That's
in the
when you say
Middle
one of
East.
their visions, you say ISIS.
ISIS is a
They
vision.
want to bring back the great Ottoman Empire in a world before World War I, basically.
That is their vision under a caliphate, which the last caliphate had been in the Ottoman Empire.
Right. And
so
Syria, of course, is a critical ingredient to that because it's right in the middle of it all, right?
Syria is in the middle of the Middle East, and the pattern of the French and British imperial presence in that region was to set up minority control of those different colonies. So the Alawite minority that runs Syria today was disproportionately educated in the military officer corps. So in the various coups of the 1950s and early 60s, the Alawites grew in power until President Assad took over in a coup, and his family and dynasty, extended family, has run the country since about 1970. So what we've faced in the last 6 years or so, since the nascent movement toward Arab Spring democratization in around 2011, what we're facing is the attempt to find a way past the Assad regime's minority rule through various nonviolent and violent movements. Saddam Hussein was also minority rule in Iraq, and he was taken out in 2003 at the UN, at the United States invasion. The challenge in Syria is that the government in Syria maintains a very broad coalition of minority groups, and a significant percentage of the Sunni majority are still with the Assad government. So the challenge is how to find a way for the majority Sunnis to rule the country more democratically, like the majority Shiites now rule in Iraq. But that transition phase has been problematic in Iraq, and it's also very problematic in Syria because Syria is a client state for Russia, and Russia has strong interest in determining the outcome.
Well, that was my next question. Does the proxy war between the U.S. and Russia in Syria make what's happening in Syria and any efforts at peace much less likely, or are we somehow helping?
There are various proxies, and the word war is strange because the U.S. and Russia are also holding hands in the sense that they coordinate deconfliction arrangements to make sure their aircraft are not either shooting each other down or hitting each other on various bombing runs over the country. So they're actively coordinating, or at least had been until the recent gas attack, actively coordinating at the security level and at the diplomatic and negotiations level in other places, but they're also working their various proxy forces on the ground. The U.S. has lined up with the Gulf Arab states and Turkey, supporting the Sunni rebel groups, some of whom are more secular, the majority of whom are more jihadi-oriented. And the Russians have stood behind the Syrian regime because they have a naval base in Tartus, and they've had a long-term protecting arrangement with the Syrian government.
Here's one of the things I think that it's so difficult for most Americans to wrap their heads around, is that we continue to support the very people that we're attacking. We continue to support, at times, the very people that we say are our enemies, and that we end up fighting. Or is that just the Middle East? Is that how you do it there?
One of my interests is following the blogs of various retired U.S. intelligence personnel and their friends in the commentary section. And at one point last year, there was lament on the fact that a CIA-supported group in Syria was actually fighting a Pentagon-supported group in Syria, both with U.S.-supplied weaponry, because the internal territorial and alliance dynamics happen to set them against each other, because the alliances do shift, and the various rebel groups, and there are many, shift in terms of near-term strategic interest about who they align with to maximize their potential power in the future.
I can remember one of my takeaways from I went to grad school for anthropology, and I remember one of the books we read was this fantastic historic ethnography of Afghanistan. And the takeaway from that book was this anthropologist who realized there's no state here, and what is an alliance today could completely change tomorrow. That these warring tribes, basically, gangs writ large, are constantly shifting their alliances, and they have for hundreds, thousands of years. That's just how it's been done there. And I remember my professor saying, this is why Russia will lose. This is many years ago. He said, this is why Russia will lose in Afghanistan, and this is why if we ever go in, we're going to lose. Because your enemy today is your friend tomorrow, and it's constantly changing.
International players tend to get caught in that churn. And as you well know, empires go to die in Afghanistan. The challenge right now is that various global and regional powers are lining up over Syria. And the end game in Syria is not clear yet, with the Sunni world being very fearful of Iranian influence, predominance across the Shiite crescent from western Afghanistan to southern Lebanon. And so there is currently a move supported by 6 think tanks in Washington, D.C., and new actions on the ground within the last week to create an enclave of Sunni majority control in eastern Syria. So U.S. and Jordanian-supported opposition rebels have moved up in eastern Syria in the desert region south of Deir Zor and Palmyra, have moved up into that region to push out ISIS, to have to begin that enclave. And Turkey has begun shelling the Kurdish forces and attacking with aircraft the Kurdish forces in the northeast of Syria above Hasaki to begin pushing down from the north. So what some observers note is there may be the beginning of a pincer move for the sake of control of eastern Syria to have a Sunni enclave there.
Which means what long term? A Sunni enclave in Syria? You already said it's a majority Sunni country anyway, right?
The challenge is that Russian air support, which began in 2015, has turned the tide of the battle for the Assad regime. So Aleppo is now in the government control, and government forces are moving north into Idlib above Hama and are taking over territory that is under Sunni jihadi control. So there's a sense in which the only place left for Sunnis will be that eastern corridor, and the big element in that consideration is whether there will be a continuous Shiite crescent across the northern part of the Middle East, or whether there will be a Sunni column down the center of the Middle East, at least in the eastern part of Syria.
Which is what Western interests want to see, right? We don't want to see that Shia crescent stretching across the Middle East from Iran into Lebanon.
The U.S. have traditionally allied themselves with Gulf Arab states who are feeling increasingly threatened by
Iran.
Shiite minorities in their countries or majorities in the situation of Bahrain and Iran.
And Iran is all too willing to fund them, those rebel Shia groups in those majority Sunni countries, right?
Iran has funded Hezbollah and supported them in southern Syria at about 30-some% of the population, but the military power in Lebanon. Iran has now functionally inserted itself into various aspects of Iraqi politics after the 2003 invasion. And Iran is closely supporting the Syrian regime, both with advisors and Shiite militia fighters from Iraq, Afghanistan, Afghani refugees in Iran. So there's a whole range of Shiite fighters with Iranian coordination from various parts of the Shiite world fighting in Syria, and Yemen
too, yeah.
But the Sunnis also have fighters from the whole Sunni world, including China, the Uyghurs.
Yeah.
So the challenge is it's becoming a regional battle along those sectarian lines for the future of Syria.
Roy, for the American viewer who tries hard but literally can't wrap their mind around this, Sunni, Shia, help us understand what the heck is going on and why these people are fighting each other. They're all the same religion, right? Is it too simple to say, well, it's sort of like Catholics versus Protestants in Ireland? They're Christians, but they've fought each other forever. Is that too simplistic, or is that sort of a handle that we can use to start to understand this schism, this really long-running, historic, violent schism in the Middle East?
I'll come back to Ireland in a second, but want to note that the economic level of the battle over Syria is mostly around 3 pipelines that are envisioned. One from Qatar bringing their gas across Syria, which was proposed in the early 2000s, to the Mediterranean to get to the European market, which the Russians had pretty much a monopoly on gas exports too. And the Russians, with the Syrians, said no to that, which began the Gulf Arab push against the Assad regime. It wasn't just a democratic movement. There were economic interests you can read about in John F. Kennedy Jr.'s article in Politico.
Are you trying to say this has something to do with oil and natural gas?
The Shiites, on the second hand, the Shiites in Iran want to build what was called an Islamic pipeline across Iran, Iraq, and Syria to export the Iranian side of that same gas field into the Mediterranean. So because of the instability in the region now, neither of those 2 pipelines can be built. And the complicating factor is the Israelis have been in touch with the Turks about what will happen to the future of a huge Israeli offshore gas field and the export potential of that. But since the region's in conflict and there are various
it's not
economic
just religion.
It's not just religion. But coming back to the tensions between Sunnis and Shiites, they have increased and decreased over the years. The president of Iran, Khatami, in the late 1990s, visited Saudi Arabia.
Right.
There was an attempt to improve relations and find a way forward. When Ahmadinejad came to power with his style of leadership, that and for various other regional developments, including the invasion of Iraq in 2003, the fear in the Sunni Gulf Arab states increased because of the emerging power of Iran in the region. So it's changed the relationship. The real battle right now is becoming vicious. So in the bus bombings in western Aleppo 2 weeks ago, there was a Sunni attack on Shiite villagers who were being bused past Sunnis in an exchange of populations between 2 Sunni villages west of Damascus and 2 Shiite villages that were surrounded by Sunni rebels north of Aleppo. When those buses were literally passing each other, Sunnis blew up the Shiite buses and killed about 100 people, including many children. The challenge is right now that the sectarian dynamics in Syria are getting to the point of almost no return, like they were at a certain point in the Northern Ireland situation. Northern Ireland took 30 years to get to an established peace process. I've had students from Northern Ireland, and I have friends who've worked the angles of that conflict for 30 years. 25 years to 30 years.
And it's amazing to think that they made it work. That there
it work.
is peace in a place in Ireland where people were convinced there would never be peace. That these Catholics and these Protestants, they were going to fight each other forever.
In June 2012, the Queen of England, dressed in green, visited Northern Ireland and shook the hand of Martin McGuinness, former head of the Provisional Irish Republican Army. His friends were the militants in the Irish Republican Army that were setting off bombs in London.
They were blowing
and
up
England.
London buses, of course. Yeah.
Same kind of terrorist attacks. An incremental peace process carried out by about 600 NGOs working the angles of that enmity construct eventually led toward a political settlement. Two people I know personally got awards from the Queen of England, the Order of the Empire Award, for their 20-plus years of peace-building work on both sides of that conflict. And they were working primarily the religious angles between the Catholic identity and the Protestant identity, which had significant political overlay like Shiite and Sunni do.
So what's the
East.
lesson there? What's the lesson from Ireland if there is, well, let me back up a minute. Is there hope for the Middle East? And if so, what are the lessons from Ireland that people like you are taking into the Middle East and sitting down with these people and saying, look, we know this works. When it comes to peace building, this is what works.
I know peace builders based in Lebanon who've brought in South Africans to Lebanon to talk to Syrians on different sides of the conflict to say, this is what we did in South Africa. Okay? We made it happen between the black and white over apartheid.
Right.
There are others who brought in folks from Northern Ireland in other regional conflicts to tell the story, to begin to develop an imagination for a way forward that takes various factions and various militias beyond the hood of reaction. If I just kill a few more of them, that will solve the problem. It usually doesn't. Civil wars like in Syria tend to last about 10 years, and this one, because of its regional structure, will probably last longer. And the challenge in Syria is that there are probably 4 levels to the conflict: local, national, regional, and international, where each of the players at those levels have interests that may not be obviously served by what's happening, so they will put their hand in and to manipulate the dynamics to move the 4-level chess field. And it's very complex right now, but there is a way through. Professor Appleby from University of Notre Dame at the United States Institutes of Peace celebration of their 10-year work with religion and peace building. US-funded organization. They have a beautiful building downtown DC, right on the mall. It's a fascinating structure. He said 600 NGOs in Northern Ireland over about 30 years brought about that peace through what he called a saturation effort. What the world needs to do is not just saturate that region with arms right now, but work with groups who are representing in political processes outside of Syria, in Geneva or Istana or elsewhere, work with groups to begin to imagine a way forward, or else Syria will be in a constant state of war probably for the next decade or
And
two.
as you say, it's in the heart of the Middle East. But we began this conversation by you saying, it wasn't too long ago when Syria was very close to an historic peace deal in the Middle East. So arguably there was peace in Syria, and yet still a lot of conflict in the Middle East. So just because peace comes to Syria doesn't necessarily mean we're going to see peace in Iraq, peace in Yemen.
There's peace defined in different ways. Internally, the political nature of the Syrian regime was very repressive because it was a minority group trying to control a whole range of groups. So its police state was very, very stringent in the way it tracked people and helped rule the country. But it was peaceful inside Syria, and that is what many groups who would like more democracy fear right now, that the chaos of a jihadi Muslim militant run Syria is probably going to be worse than what's in Syria now under the Assad regime. So the fear of the transition is keeping many people from supporting opposition fighters. The peace around Syria was pretty significant. That Syria did not go to war against any of its neighbors, except it had an occupation force in Lebanon for over a decade as a result of their civil war, and in part at their invitation to make sure that civil war did not
spill over into
Syria, Syria or elsewhere. So Syria has not attacked other countries regionally. It's played games like many countries do with other factions in the region. But the challenge is Syria's future if there is not peace, will continue to hold that region and major players like Russia and the US and China and others in a state of constant conflict, which have led commentators to say, are we nearing a new Cold War? So the challenge is whether Syria will catalyze international conflicts in ways that are significantly destabilizing.
You've mentioned a few times, Roy, the removal, the Bush administration's removal of Saddam Hussein from power in Iraq. And as a result, the utter destabilization of the Iraqi state. Was that a mistake? Can we look back now? Or did you say even then, this is not smart? Saddam Hussein is a cork in the bottle. He's a Ba'athist, which for those who don't know, he was a secularist. He didn't believe in the union of church and state like so many Sunni do or so many Shia do. He absolutely rejected that idea. And it was a very Western idea, separation of church and state. Saddam Hussein was all about that. Al-Qaeda wasn't in Iraq when Saddam Hussein was there. Was that a mistake?
I'll say three things in response to that question. Both presidential candidates in the last election described the 2003 invasion as a mistake, fairly clearly, or expressed regrets for their support of it. In 2003 in April, I gave a speech in Harrisonburg with a number of other professors, and the title of my speech was "Another Peace to End All Peace." Is this Sykes-Picot all over again?
Right.
If we invade, we decapitate Iraq, and we literally flip the region into a state of turmoil long term. Depending on how this has worked, in the way the book Peace to End All Peace by Fromkin, Boston University historian, describes what happened after the Sykes-Picot agreement, how it set up those potential conflicts.
And make it much more likely to be a satellite state of Iran, too, with Shia influence.
Yes. The challenge is it wasn't just the Bush regime. The Obama regime did the same thing in Libya when they took out Gaddafi.
Great point.
And we have chaos in Libya now with Islamic State and others trying to establish and have established on the ground geographical contiguous area, which is being shrunk now through counterattacks. But the Russians said yes to that attack on Libya with the understanding that would be protecting civilians in a limited area. They did not know that the effect would be taking out Gaddafi long term. So they are stringent now in not allowing the same thing to happen. Strident in not allowing the same thing to happen in Syria. So they have vetoed every United Nations Security Council resolution that condemns the current Syrian regime.
Because they want to see Assad in power in the same way. Do we continue to see Western leaders in an effort to try to maybe score some political points at home, look tough on TV, make really stupid mistakes in places like the Middle East or Libya, and cause untold numbers of people to die, and create these really broken states that invite, almost guarantee, the ascendancy of groups like ISIS?
That is a complicated question that has many levels.
I ask complicated questions, Roy.
The challenge in understanding the layers of that question are loaded. General Wesley Clark, former presidential candidate, former head of NATO, you can watch him on YouTube, said after 9/11 he was shown a memo in the Pentagon when he visited general friends saying these are the 7 countries that we're going to take down eventually. And most of them have gone down. So the question of intent and what has been realized is a significant background question for some. It's been called conspiratorial, but some retired intelligence officers have said that this is functionally what is happening. So we need to be aware of how the United States is being perceived in the region as functionally carrying out that program that General Wesley Clark described. In that sense, our policy and practice has delegitimized our presence in the region. And I don't underestimate what that might mean long term.
And certainly any genuine peace-building efforts, it certainly delegitimized that in many regards. At least as far as the State Department goes, right?
There are various organizations working at peace building now.
Yeah,
the Carter
yeah.
Center,
Oh, yeah. Doing
various
amazing
religious
work.
players,
Right.
various NGOs working to help align the interests that are involved regionally to find a way through that would stop the worst humanitarian crisis since World War II, and what could become the worst international strategic conflict since World War II.
We could be we are on the precipice of that now.
It depends on how leadership here and in Moscow position themselves in relation to what might happen. I will also say that the State Department and the Russian Foreign Ministry have been cooperating at various stages on attempting to find a peace settlement. And there have been various Geneva rounds, there have been independent Russian and Central Asian state peace processes. There have been various attempts to find a way through. I'm not saying that leadership here is only working at military options. What I am saying is, unless the military options are coordinated well with the potential emergence of various peace processes, we'll easily be thrown back into conflict through catalytic acts of violence, which any side can play right now.
Roy, thank you for being here.
welcome.
And thank you for the work that you do. Let's talk again. Let's get you back on the show again very soon. Roy Hange teaches at the Summer Peacebuilding Institute at Eastern Mennonite University. You can learn more online at emu.edu, and he also teaches peacebuilding at UVA. You can find a complete archive of this program online right now at mediaandcitizenship.org. Have a terrific week, and y'all be good to each other.